genuine well-wishers and constructive critics, I presume you, your dear and near, are in fine feather. It's Professor Suresh, delighted to be back for my 42nd video in pipeline for publication on YouTube today, 9th of July 2020. Topic for discussion today is Enlightenment of human rights. Human rights are moral principles or norms that describe certain standards of human behavior and are regularly protected as natural and legal rights in municipal and international law. They are commonly understood as inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled simply because he or she is a human being, and which are inherent in all human beings, regardless of the age, ethnic origin, location, language, religion, ethnicity, or any other status. They are applicable everywhere and at every time in the sense of being universal, and they are egalitarian in the sense of being the same for everyone. They are regarded as requiring empathy and the rule of law and imposing an obligation on persons to respect the human rights of others, and it is generally considered that they should not be taken away except as a result of due process based on specific circumstances. For example, human rights may include freedom from unlawful imprisonment, torture, and execution. The doctrine of human rights has been highly influential within international law and global and regional institutions. Actions by states and non-governmental organizations form a basis of public policy worldwide. The idea of human rights suggests that if the public discourse of peacetime global society can be said to have a common moral language, it is that of human rights. Human rights are the idea that all people should have rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 1 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, shortly UDHR. Hold on. Let me repeat. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 1 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, shortly UDHR. Today, the principles are protected as legal rights in national and international law. They are seen as universal, which means that they are meant for everyone, no matter what their race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, age, sex. Sex means gender. Also, women's rights, political beliefs, or any other kind of beliefs, intelligence, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Every person has all of these rights, and it is not possible to only grant some of them. All human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent and related. The international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis. The idea of human rights originated from ideas found in religion and philosophy in Western Europe. Most of the things that were enacted as laws were blasphemy or mandated by God, religion, whatever. Later on they became conventions or traditions. Then they were enacted as laws. Many of the basic ideas that animated the human rights movement developed in the aftermath of the Second World War and the events of the Holocaust, culminating in the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Paris by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. Ancient people did not have the same modern day conception of universal human rights. At the time they were not even knowledgeable about rights. The true forerunner of human rights discourse was the concept of natural rights, which appeared as part of the medieval natural law tradition that became prominent during the European Enlightenment, with such philosophers as John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, and Jacques Barlamaqui, and which featured prominently in the political discourse of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. From this foundation, the modern human rights arguments emerged over the later half of the 20th century, possibly as a reaction to slavery, torture, genocide, and war crimes, as a realization of inherent human vulnerability and as being a precondition for the possibility of a just society. The modern Western idea of human rights started in the European Enlightenment. In the 16th century, some people started suggesting that everyone had the religious and political right to choose their religion and their leaders. This sort of thinking was important in the English Civil War. After the war, the philosopher John Locke argued that people should have these rights. He was one of the first people to call them human rights. John Locke, so we can say he is the propounder or father of human rights. Who is another? These ideas were also important in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, in the 18th century. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill. These people are popular for their ethical theories also. John Locke, John Stuart Mill was an important philosopher who also thought about human rights. He said that people should be able to control their own bodies and minds. He talked about three special ideas. 1. Freedom of speech. 2. Freedom of assembly. 3. Freedom to do what a person wishes if it does not harm the others, even if other people think it is bad. Hegel was a philosopher who talked about the idea of free will. He also talked about what makes a person free, that a person has to have certain relations with other people to have true freedom. A person has to be able to own property, make contracts with other people, make moral promises to people, live with anyone, get protection from laws, have a voice in government. Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, approved by the National Assembly of France on August 26, 1789. Some of the important places those human rights laws are written in constitutions. The United States Constitution and Constitution of France are two of the oldest set of laws based on human rights. In 1948, the United Nations made the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a widely respected document that says what the United Nations believes are human rights. As a matter of fact, now United Nations is the controlling body or the governing body. I won't say control, governing. It is not a law, but is a basis on which two important agreements are written: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These are United Nations human rights covenants, agreements between people or countries. That's what covenant means. The countries who sign these two covenants agree to follow them. In addition to those declaration and covenants, there are many treaties and documents made by United Nations and other international organizations. Those treaties and documents are called International Human Rights Law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, shortly UDHR, as I mentioned before, is a non-binding declaration adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, partly in response to the barbarism of World War II. The UDHR urges member states to promote a number of human, civil, economic and social rights, asserting these rights are part of the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. The declaration was the first international legal effort to limit the behavior of states and press upon them duties to the citizens following the model of the rights-duty duality. Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of other members of human family is a foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. The UDHR was framed by members of the Human Rights Commission with Eleanor Roosevelt as chair, who began to discuss an International Bill of Rights in 1947. The members of the Constitution did not immediately agree on the form of such a Bill of Rights and whether or how it should be enforced. The Commission proceeded to frame the UDHR and accompanying treaties, but the UDHR quickly became the priority. Canadian law professor John Humphrey and French lawyer René Cassin were responsible for much of the cross-national research on the structure of the document respectively, where the articles of the declaration were interpretative of the general principle of the preamble. The document was structured by Cassin to include the basic principles of dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood in the first two articles, followed successively by rights pertaining to individuals. Rights of individuals in relation to each other and to groups, spiritual, public, and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights. The final three articles place, according to Cassin, rights in the context of limits, duties, and the social and political order in which they have to be realized. Humphrey and Cassin intended the rights in the UDHR to be legally enforceable through some means, as is reflected in the third clause of the preamble, whereas it is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. The onset of the Cold War, soon after the UDHR was conceived, brought to the fore divisions over the inclusion of both economic and social rights and civil and political rights in the declaration. Capitalist states tended to place strong emphasis on civil and political rights, such as freedom of association and expression, and were reluctant to include economic and social rights, such as the right to work and the right to join a union. Socialist states placed much greater importance on economic and social rights and argued strongly for their inclusion. Although Russia is a socialist country, China is a communist country, capitalist country examples are many, starting with the United States and all that. Although the UDHR is a non-binding resolution, it is now considered to be a central component of international customary law, which may be invoked under appropriate circumstances by state judiciaries and other judiciaries. In 1966, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR shortly, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, shortly ICESCR, were adopted by the United Nations between them, making the rights contained in the UDHR binding on all states. However, they came into force only in 1976 when they were ratified by a sufficient number of countries. Despite achieving the ICCPR, a covenant including no economic or social rights, the US only ratified the ICCPR in 1992. The ICESCR commits 155 state parties to work toward the granting of economic, social, and cultural rights (ESCR) to individuals. Since then, numerous other treaties, pieces of legislation have been offered at the international level. They are generally known as human rights instruments. Some of the most significant are Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Genocide is racial killing. Adopted 1948, entry into force 1951. Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Give me a minute. Adopted 1966, entry into force 1969. Racial discrimination is a problem in developed countries like US and all that. The recent protests held all over US and European countries. Black Lives Matter, after the death of a black. Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW, entry into force 1981. United Nations Convention Against Torture, CAT, adopted 1984, entry into force 1985. Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, adopted 1989, entry into force 1989. International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, shortly ICRMW, adopted 1990. Rome Statute of the International Criminal Code, ICC shortly, entry into force 2002, entry into force in the sense that is when it was brought into force. The United Nations. UN is the only multilateral government agency with universally accepted international jurisdiction for universal human rights legislation. That's why I said they are the governing body, controlling all these things, framing the rules and regulations, whatever. All UN organs have advisory roles to the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and there are numerous committees within the UN with the responsibilities for safeguarding different human rights treaties. Treaties, or agreements. The most senior body of the UN with regard to human rights is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The UN Human Rights Council, created in 2005 as a mandate to investigate alleged human rights violations. Forty-seven of the 193 UN member states sit on the council, elected by simple majority in a secret ballot of the United Nations General Assembly. Members serve a maximum of 6 years and may have their membership suspended for gross human rights abuses. The council is based in Geneva and meets, that is the headquarters of United Nations, and meets 3 times a year with additional meetings to respond to urgent situations. Independent experts, called as rapporteurs, are retained by the council to investigate alleged human rights abuses and they report to the council. The Human Rights Council may request that the Security Council refer cases to the International Criminal Code, shortly ICC, not the ICC that you are thinking of, even if the issue being referred is outside the normal jurisdiction of the ICC. Again, ICC for International Criminal Code. In addition to the political bodies whose mandate flows from the UN Charter, the UN has set up a number of treaty-based bodies comprising committees of independent experts who monitor compliance with the human rights standards. Somebody has to ensure the compliance, right? Enforce. Otherwise, it's as good as not having anything. Okay, human rights standards and norms flowing from the core international human rights treaties. They are supported by and are created by the treaty, and they monitor, with the exception of CESCR, which was established under a resolution of the Economic and Social Council to carry out the monitoring functions originally assigned to that body under the covenant. They are technically autonomous bodies established by the treaties that they monitor and accountable to the state parties of those treaties rather than subsidiary to the United Nations. Though in practice they are closely intertwined with the United Nations system and are supported by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNHCHR, and the UN Center for Human Rights. The Human Rights Committee promotes participation in the standards of the ICCPR. The members of the committee express opinions on member countries and make judgments on individual complaints against countries which have ratified an optional protocol to the treaty. The judgments, termed views, and are not legally binding. The member of the committee meets around 3 times a year to hold sessions. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights monitors ICESCR and makes general comments on ratifying countries' performance. It will have the power to receive complaints against the countries that opted in the United Optional Protocol once it has come into force. It is important to note that unlike the other treaty bodies, the Economic Committee is not an autonomous body responsible to the treaty parties, but directly responsible to the Economic and Social Council and ultimately to the General Assembly. This means that the Economic Committee faces particular difficulties at its disposal only relatively weak means of implementation in comparison to other treaty bodies. Particular difficulties noted by commentators include perceived vagueness of the principles of the treaty, relative lack of legal texts and decisions, ambivalence of many states in addressing economic, social and cultural rights, comparatively few non-governmental organizations focused on the area, and problems with obtaining relevant and precise information. The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination monitors the CERD and conducts regular reviews of countries' performance. It can take judgments on complaints against member states allowing it, but these are not legally binding. It issues warnings to attempt to prevent serious contraventions of the Convention. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women monitors the CEDAW. It receives states reports on their performance and comments on them and can make judgments on complaints against countries which are opted into the 1999 optional protocol. The Committee Against Torture monitors CAT and receives states reports on their performance every 4 years and comments on them. Its subcommittee may visit and inspect countries which are opted into the optional protocol. The Committee on the Rights of the Child monitors the CRC and makes comments on reports submitted by states every 5 years. It does not have the power to receive complaints. The Committee on Migrant Workers was established in 2004 and monitors ICR, MW and makes comments on reports submitted by states every 5 years. It will have the power to receive complaints of specific violations only once 10 member states allow it. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was established in 2008 to monitor the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It has the power to receive complaints against the countries which are opted into the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Committee on Enforced Disappearances monitors the ICPPED. All states parties are obliged to submit reports to the committee on how the rights are being implemented. The committee examines each report and addresses its concerns and recommendations to the state party in the form of concluding observations. Each treaty body receives secretariat support from the Human Rights Council and Treaties Division of Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, DHCHR, in Geneva, except CEDAW, which is supported by the Division of the Advancement for Women, DAW. CEDAW formerly held all its sessions at the United Nations headquarters in New York, but now frequently meets at the United Nations office in Geneva. The other treaty bodies meet in Geneva. The Human Rights Committee usually holds its March session in New York City. Global Human Rights and Development, shortly GHRAD, aims coverage in many instances and are beneficial only to the government and not the people, although there can be conflict between the different approaches. Nowadays, a human rights-based approach is viewed by many as essential to achieving development goals. Historically, the minority clauses guaranteeing civil and political rights and religious and cultural toleration to minorities were significant acts emerging from the peace process of World War I relating to people's rights to self-determination. Overseen by the League of Nations Council, the process allowed petitions from individuals and was monitored under the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of International Justice. Clauses are an important early signpost in both the human rights and development histories. The European Wars of Religion and the Civil Wars of 17th century Kingdom of England gave rise to the philosophy of liberalism, and belief in natural rights became a central concern of European intellectual culture during the 18th century age of Enlightenment. These ideas lay at the core of the American and French revolutions, which occurred toward the end of that century. Democratic evolution through the 19th century paved the way for the advent of universal suffrage in the 20th century. Two world wars led to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The post-war era saw movements arising from specific groups experiencing a shortfall in their rights, such as feminism and civil rights of African Americans. The human rights movements of members of the Soviet bloc emerged in the 1970s along with the workers' rights movements in the West. The movements quickly gelled as social activism and political rhetoric in many nations put human rights high on the world agenda. By the 21st century, historian Samuel Moyn has argued the human rights movement expanded beyond its original anti-totalitarianism to include numerous causes involving humanitarianism and social and economic development in the developing world. Some notions of righteousness present in the ancient law and religion are sometimes retrospectively included under the term human rights. While Enlightenment philosophers suggest a secular social contract between the rulers and the ruled, ancient traditions derive similar conclusions from notions of divine law. That's what I said. Blasphemies, and in Hellenistic philosophy, natural law. Samuel Moyn suggests that the concept of human rights is intertwined with a modern sense of citizenship, which did not emerge until the past few hundred years. Nonetheless, relevant examples exist in the ancient and pre-modern eras, although ancient people did not have the same modern day conception of universal human rights. Fundamental rights are right to live, to be a citizen of a country, right to housing, right to a fair trial, to own property, safety related rights, safety from violence, physical, mental and sexual, to seek asylum if a country treats you badly, fair trial, and to be considered innocent until proven guilty. General life freedoms are the right to get an education, health care, medical care, to believe and practice a religion the person wants. Rights related to sexuality and procreation, right to marriage and family, equality of both males and females, women's rights, not to be forced into marriage, the right to express his or her sexual orientation. You know about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, LGBT. Okay. Political freedoms are the right to express oneself, free speech, to vote, to peacefully protest, speak against a government or a group, to petition. Abuse means to intentionally harm a person or people physically, mentally, emotionally or verbally once or many times. Human rights abuse follows along similarly, also keeping in count the universal rights. Human rights abuse happens when a person is hurt in a way that goes against his or her human rights. That's why we call it as abuse, improper usage. Human rights abuses are also called as human rights violations. Examples of human rights abuses or violations are putting a person in jail because they say the government is doing bad things, or because they are religious or not religious. It is against democracy. Taking a person's home because they are from a different country. It happens in Middle East countries. If you are a foreigner, you can't even buy any property in most of the Muslim countries. Not letting someone who is a citizen of a country vote because he or she has a wrong kind of attribute. Violence towards someone because they have or any religion or a different religion to the one of the abuser. Many people, groups and countries think protecting human rights is very important, but not everyone in the world believes in human rights. If people do not believe in human rights or political power, they can hurt many people. Even if these people have no political power, they can be violent to other people. Nowadays, you know about the social media and all that. They try to tarnish the image, try to create a wrong picture about some groups. There are many people who work to protect everyone's human rights. Some of these are government groups and some are not with any government. They are sometimes called human rights organizations. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are examples of human rights organizations. As per Indian Constitution, fundamental rights are defined as basic human rights of all citizens. These rights, defined in Part 3 of the Constitution, irrespective of race, place of birth, religion, caste, creed, or gender. Fundamental rights include right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, right to constitutional remedies. Right to equality is one of the chief guarantees of Constitution of India. The Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955, Article 17 states punishments against untouchability for not allowing a person to enter a place of worship, and from taking water from a tanker well. Article 1919 guarantees citizens of India the following fundamental freedoms subject to certain restrictions: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to form associations, freedom of movement, freedom of residence and settlement, freedom of occupation, profession, trade and business. All of us are aware of right to education, RTE, and right to information, RIT. Child labor and beggars are prohibited under rights under against exploitation. Article 23 prohibits human trafficking and forced labor or any act compelling a person to work without wages. Article 24 prohibits employment of children below the age of 14 years in factories, mines and other hazardous jobs. Employment of Children Act 1938 was the first act to prevent child labor. Articles is really preventing. Articles 25 to 28 provide religious freedom to all citizens and ensures a secular state in India. Article 25 guarantees all persons the freedom of conscience and the right to preach, practice and propagate any religion of their choice. Article 26 guarantees all religious denominations or sections subject to public order, morality and health. Article 27 guarantees, why do they say guarantee? Okay. Freedom for payment of taxes. No person can be compelled to pay taxes for promotion or maintenance for any particular religion or religious institution. Cultural and educational rights as per Articles 28 and 29 are measures to protect the rights of cultural, linguistic and religious minorities by enabling them to conserve their heritage and protecting them against discrimination. Right to constitutional remedies empower citizens to approach the Supreme Court of India to seek enforcement or protection against infringement of their fundamental rights. There are a variety of human rights, including civil rights such as the rights to life, liberty and security, political rights like rights to the protection of the law and equality before the law, economic rights, hold on, I'm doing some editing also. Economic rights including rights to work, to own property and to receive equal pay. Social rights like rights to education and consenting marriages. Cultural rights including the right to freely participate in the cultural community. And 6, collective rights like the right to self-determination. Slavery, forced labor and human trafficking are violations of human rights because these acts strip human beings of the inherent rights. In fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly references slavery, stating in Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. The human rights most relevant to trafficking. Human trafficking are the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status, the right to life, the right to liberty and security, the right not to be submitted to slavery, servitude, forced labor or bonded labor, the right not to be subjected to torture under cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, the right to be free from gendered violence. The right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of movement, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to just and favorable conditions of work, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to social security, the right of children and to special protection. Human rights for women and girls are trafficked and enslaved women and girls oftentimes do not attend school. Many times these women and girls are illiterate. Trafficked and enslaved women and girls face gross sexual violence, whether in forced prostitution, forced marriage or during forced physical labor. Trafficked and enslaved women and girls are subject to domestic violence. Trafficked and enslaved women and girls do not have access to reproductive and maternal health. The physical and sexual abuse of the exploitation leads to many early pregnancies, forced abortions, pre-medical termination of pregnancy, and exposure to HIV and other diseases. Trafficked and enslaved women and girls do not have access to health care. Trafficked and enslaved women and girls often face critical malnutrition. Trafficked and enslaved women and girls do not have access to anti-poverty programs, micro loans, or other economic development initiatives, leaving them dependent on their exploiters. Now that all of you have acquired more than sufficient knowledge of human rights, let us move to reality. We need to admit the following harsh facts. Especially in countries like ours: child labor, begging for arms, exploitation of girls and women, the exploitation of children, bonded laborer system, underpayment, payment below par in most of the occupations, discrimination based on gender, caste and religion, reservation system in employment and education, restrictions on freedom of speech and expression, inhuman treatment by government officials and bureaucrats. Elders and senior citizens are left to fend for themselves. Human trafficking, illegal sale of banned substances, illegal trading of virtual currency, money laundering, worst customer service, especially in banks, commercial establishments, business organizations, in reference to so-called after-sale service. Lack of consumer protection, untouchability is still very much rampant, especially in rural areas. Honor killings, which is sabotaging individuals' right to marry the person of their choice. Child marriages, corruption in all walks of life, premeditated crimes by affluent people in society, and they manage to go scot-free because of the affluence. Altruistic, unethical practices in professions like medical, education and religion, which were considered to be noble professions in the olden times. The list is infinite. I have mentioned only the main violations of human rights. As a matter of fact, animals are getting much more protection than human beings in countries like ours. There are so many bodies that protect the animals. First of all, one has to protect the human beings, treat the humans as humans. That is lacking now. For example, an accident happens, nowadays people don't have the tendency to help the accident victim. They are more bothered about taking the video using their damn so-called smart cell phone by dumb people, and posting them on social media, especially Facebook, WhatsApp, as if it's an achievement. You don't hang such people to death. Debates, discussion on topics like this can go on forever. Anyway, let me call it a day. We'll meet again real soon. Rest in peace and harmony. Always watch these videos with closed captions, subtitles for absolute 100% comprehension. As per my persistent recommendation, I know I rushed through to complete the presentation within 20 minutes max. This is the time limit I had set myself to retain the viewer's attention as of now. I know nowadays I exceed this time limit since I make honest attempts to cover the selected topic more elaborately, including so many intricate fine details, referring a wide variety of sources, in particular Wikipedia quite extensively, besides articles and books published recently. Besides, I add my own salt and pepper and masala based on my personal experiences so far in my life, and also intuition. Stay at home as much as possible to maintain social distancing attributed to pandemic novel COVID-19 and prolong your lifespan. Lead a healthy life. God alone can put a stop to natural or unnatural events like pandemics, which may be bio-war, cyber war also. Events like pandemics which may lead to apocalypse and extinction of all sentient species on earth.